The letter arrived on a Tuesday, forwarded 3 times before finally catching up with Commander Ethan Cross at his temporary quarters in Virginia Beach. It was the kind of envelope that looked like it had traveled through time, yellowed at the edges, sealed with wax that had cracked during transit, addressed in the careful cursive of someone who'd learned penmanship in a different era. Ethan turned it over in his calloused hands, noting the return address: Bergman and Associates, Attorneys at Law, Crescent Bay, Oregon. He didn't know any lawyers in Oregon, didn't know anyone in Oregon, period. His German shepherd, Gage, lifted his massive head from where he'd been dozing in the shaft of afternoon sunlight that cut across the sparse quarters. The dog's amber eyes tracked Ethan's movements with the focused intelligence of a military working dog who'd spent 8 years reading his handler's every micro-expression. "What do you think, boy?" Ethan murmured, breaking the seal. "Bills? Lawsuit? Someone finally realized I never returned that library book in 7th grade?" Gage's tail thumped once against the floor. "Whatever it is, I'm with you." Ethan unfolded the letter, and as he read, his eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. "Dear Commander Cross, it is with great regret that we inform you of the passing of Thomas Michael Cross, formerly of Crescent Bay, Oregon. Mr. Cross passed away peacefully in his sleep on March 15th at the age of 87. As the sole surviving heir, you have been named as the primary beneficiary of Mr. Cross's estate. Said estate consists of one residential property located at 1847 Widows Peak Road, Crescent Bay, along with all structures, land, and personal effects contained therein. We understand you may have questions regarding your relationship to the deceased, as records indicate minimal contact over the past 3 decades. Mr. Cross was your paternal grandfather. He expressed in his final wishes that the property be transferred to you with the hope that you might find in it something he could not. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to discuss the transfer of deed and estate settlement. Sincerely, Jonathan Bergman." Ethan read the letter 3 times, each pass bringing more confusion than clarity. Grandfather. He'd never met the man. Hell, he'd barely known his father. Daniel Cross had died in a construction accident when Ethan was 6, leaving behind little more than a Purple Heart from Vietnam, a drinking problem nobody talked about, and a single photograph of him in his Army uniform, young and solemn. His mother had raised him alone, working double shifts as an ER nurse, while Ethan bounced between after-school programs and the homes of family friends. She'd never mentioned family on his father's side. He'd assumed there wasn't any, or that they wanted nothing to do with the widow and child left behind. Now, apparently, there had been a grandfather, in Oregon, on a cliff. Ethan pulled out his laptop and searched 1847 Widows Peak Road, Crescent Bay, Oregon. The property photos made his jaw tighten. The house, if you could call it that, was a weathered structure of gray wood and broken windows perched on a rocky promontory that jutted into the Pacific Ocean like an accusatory finger. 3 stories of sagging roof, peeling paint, and what looked like active structural damage. The surrounding land was windswept and barren, more rock than soil, with stunted trees bent permanently sideways from decades of coastal storms. The real estate listing, marked "Sale Failed, Off Market," was even more damning. Historic property with ocean views, significant renovation required, property has been uninhabitable for 15+ years. Zoning restrictions prevent demolition. Cliff erosion presents ongoing structural concerns. Sale contingent on buyer assuming all liability for property condition and coastal setback violations. Translation: it was worthless. Maybe worse than worthless, it was a liability. Ethan looked at Gage. "We just inherited a death trap on a crumbling cliff that nobody wants." Gage tilted his head as if to say, "Sounds like an adventure." Despite everything, the absurdity of inheriting property from a grandfather he'd never met, the obvious worthlessness of said property, the fact that he was supposed to report for his next assignment in 6 weeks, Ethan felt something stir in his chest. Curiosity, maybe, or the particular brand of stubbornness that had carried him through Bud-S training, through deployments in places where the temperature hit 130 degrees and the enemy was everywhere and nowhere, through the loss of teammates whose names were carved into his memory like scars. He'd been granted 30 days of mandatory leave after his last deployment, a mission he wasn't allowed to discuss, in a country he wasn't allowed to name, that had ended with 3 of his team members in body bags and Ethan himself sporting a purple addition to his fruit salad of ribbons. The Navy shrink had used words like processing and integration and necessary decompression. Ethan had nodded through the whole session, said the right things, and spent the following 2 weeks running until his legs gave out and staring at walls until sleep dragged him under. He was 34 years old, had spent half his life in the service, and had no idea who he was when he wasn't being shot at. Maybe a condemned house on a cliff in Oregon was exactly what he needed. Or maybe he'd finally lost his mind. "What do you say, Gage?" Ethan asked, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Want to see the ocean?" Gage barked once, sharp and decisive. That settled it. 3 days later, Ethan's F-150 rumbled down Highway 11, the Pacific Ocean appearing and disappearing beyond the tree line like a massive, restless beast. Gage rode shotgun, nose pressed against the window, ears perked forward at every new scent carried by the salt-thick air. Crescent Bay wasn't much of a town, a single main street lined with weathered storefronts, a bait shop, a diner that looked like it had been serving the same coffee since 1952, and a gas station with pumps that predated digital displays. Population 1,247 according to the faded sign. Ethan stopped at the gas station to fuel up and ask for directions. The attendant, a leathery man in his 60s with eyes like tide pools, studied him carefully when Ethan mentioned Widow's Peak Road. "You the grandson, then?" the man said. It wasn't a question. "That obvious?" Tom Cross didn't have many visitors. Word gets around. The attendant pumped gas with practiced efficiency. "House ain't safe, you know. Cliff's been eroding for 30 years. Tom wouldn't leave, stubborn as a barnacle. Died in his sleep up there, alone. So I heard. You planning to sell it? Developer's been sniffing around for decades. Town council would probably throw you a parade if you finally let them tear it down." Ethan thought about the photos, about the way the house clung to that rocky outcropping like it was holding on out of pure spite. "Haven't decided yet." The attendant grunted, a sound that conveyed volumes of skepticism. "Widow's Peak Road is about 4 miles north. Turn left at the old lighthouse. Can't miss it. Road gets rough after the first mile. Hope you got 4-wheel drive." "I do." "Then good luck. You're gonna need it." Ethan paid and climbed back into the truck. Gage was vibrating with contained energy, sensing they were close to something. The dog's instincts were rarely wrong. The road to Widow's Peak was everything the attendant had promised and worse. Paved for the first mile, then deteriorating into gravel, then barely maintained dirt track that wound through dense coastal forest. Branches scraped the truck's sides. The GPS signal died half a mile in. Then the trees opened up, and Ethan saw it. The house stood at the end of a long, narrow peninsula of rock surrounded on three sides by the churning Pacific. The structure looked even worse in person, paint stripped away by wind and salt until the bare wood showed through like exposed bone. Windows dark and empty as the eyes of a skull, roof sagging in the middle like a broken spine. But there was something about it, something defiant. It shouldn't have been standing at all, and yet there it was, still clinging to the cliff despite decades of storms trying to tear it down. Ethan parked and climbed out. The wind hit him immediately, fierce and cold, carrying the scent of brine and kelp. Waves crashed against the rocks below, sending up plumes of spray that caught the afternoon light and turned it into brief, shimmering rainbows. Gage jumped down and immediately began investigating the perimeter, nose to the ground, processing 1,000 scents Ethan couldn't begin to perceive. The front door hung crooked on its hinges. Ethan pushed it open, wincing at the screech of rusted metal. Inside, the air was thick with dust and a particular smell of abandonment. Mildew, dry rot, and the ghost of lives lived and forgotten. The interior was a time capsule. Furniture covered in sheets, books on shelves, their spines faded. A kitchen with appliances from the 1970s, photographs on the walls, their subjects obscured by decades of grime. Ethan wiped the glass of one frame with his sleeve. A young man in an army uniform stared back at him. Same sharp jawline Ethan saw in the mirror every morning. Same serious eyes. His father, maybe, or his grandfather at a younger age. "Who were you?" Ethan whispered to the photograph. "And why did you leave this to me?" Gage barked from somewhere deeper in the house. Not an alert bark, but one of interest. Ethan followed the sound through a narrow hallway that smelled of mouse droppings and old paper. He found the dog in what must have been the study. 3 walls of built-in bookshelves, all still packed with volumes. A massive oak desk sat in the center, its surface buried under stacks of papers, maps, and what looked like nautical charts. But what caught Ethan's attention was the wall behind the desk. Maps, dozens of them, pinned and taped in overlapping layers. Hand-drawn sketches, topographical surveys, nautical charts with notations in cramped handwriting. And connecting them all, red strings stretched between pushpins, creating a web of connections that looked like the work of either a genius or a madman, or both. Ethan stepped closer, trying to make sense of the obsession laid out before him. His eyes caught on a phrase written in bold letters across the top of one map. "The truth is buried. Find it before they do." If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. 6 months before Thomas Cross died, he sat in the same study, hands trembling as he wrote a letter he'd rewritten a dozen times. The arthritis made his fingers ache, and his vision wasn't what it used to be, but the words finally felt right. He sealed the envelope, addressed it to the grandson he'd never met, and placed it in the desk drawer with strict instructions for his lawyer. "If I die before telling him the truth, he needs to know. He needs to understand what his father died protecting." Thomas had been 70 when he moved to this God-forsaken cliff house, running from a past that chased him like a hungry shadow. The property had been cheap, unsellable, really, and that suited him fine. He wanted isolation. He wanted to disappear. For 17 years, he'd lived alone with his secrets and his research, piecing together a puzzle that had cost him his son, his wife, and nearly his sanity. Daniel Cross, Ethan's father, hadn't died in a construction accident. That was the story the military told. The story Thomas's wife, Mary, had believed until her own death from cancer 12 years ago. The story they'd told 6-year-old Ethan. But Thomas had been a Marine Corps intelligence officer. He knew how to read between the lines, he knew what a cover-up looked like, and he'd spent the last 34 years of his life trying to prove that his son had been murdered. Daniel Cross had been part of a specialized Army unit investigating missing military equipment in 1989. Weapons, vehicles, supplies, millions of dollars worth of materiel that had simply vanished from bases across the Pacific Northwest. Daniel had been getting close to the source when his car went off a bridge in the middle of the night. Single vehicle accident, the report said. No witnesses. Blood alcohol levels suggested he'd been drinking. Case closed, but Daniel didn't drink. Not after Vietnam. He'd seen what alcohol did to his brothers in arms and had sworn off it completely. Thomas had tried to investigate. He'd used every contact, every favor, every bit of leverage he had as a retired intelligence officer. He'd gotten nowhere, or rather, he'd gotten warnings. Polite at first, then less polite. Then, finally, a threatening message that made it clear, drop it, or join your son. So, Thomas had dropped it publicly and continued privately. He'd sold his house in Seattle, abandoned his friends, cut off contact with his daughter-in-law and grandson to keep them safe, and moved to this cliff where he could work without being watched. The maps on the wall represented decades of research, financial records obtained through questionable means, property transfers, military shipping manifests, witness statements from people who'd later recanted or disappeared, satellite photos from before civilian GPS made such things routine, and at the center of it all was a single location, the cliffs beneath this very house. Thomas had discovered something 6 months ago that changed everything. A geological survey from 1943, conducted as part of coastal defense preparations during World War II. The survey had noted significant cave systems beneath the Widow's Peak promontory, natural formations that extended deep into the cliff face, accessible only at low tide. Perfect for hiding things you didn't want found. Thomas had tried to investigate the caves himself, but at 87, his body wouldn't cooperate. The descent to the beach was treacherous even for younger men. He'd made it halfway down before his hip gave out, and he'd spent 3 agonizing hours dragging himself back up. After that, he'd known he wouldn't live long enough to finish what he'd started. So he'd done the only thing he could, left everything to the grandson he'd never met, a Navy SEAL with the training and ability to do what Thomas no longer could. Find the truth, expose the conspiracy, finish what Daniel Cross had started 34 years ago. Thomas had died in his sleep, heart simply stopping like a clock running down. His last thought had been a prayer that Ethan would understand, that he'd forgive, that he'd have the courage to see it through. Now, 6 months later, that grandson stood in the same study, staring at the same maps, with the same German shepherd who'd been Thomas's only companion for the last year of his life. Purchased from a breeder specifically because he knew Ethan worked with military dogs and might bond with one when he arrived. Thomas had planned it all. Even death hadn't stopped him from trying to protect what remained of his family. 300 miles south in Portland, a phone rang in an office with no name on the door. The building was unremarkable. One of a dozen identical structures in a business park near the airport. The kind of place where companies with 3-letter names and vague missions leased space and kept their activities private. Richard Vance answered on the first ring. "Yes, we have a problem." The voice on the other end was younger, nervous. Marcus Webb, one of Vance's field operatives. The Cross property. Someone's arrived. Vance's jaw tightened. He was 62 years old, with silver hair and the kind of face that inspired confidence, trustworthy, paternal, the sort of man you'd want managing your retirement portfolio. In reality, he'd spent 4 decades managing operations that would never appear in any official record. Thomas Cross is dead, Vance said carefully. Who's at the property? His grandson, Ethan Cross, Navy SEAL, currently on leave. He showed up yesterday afternoon with a dog. He's inside the house now. Vance closed his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose. Of course, Thomas had left the property to military family. The old bastard probably thought he was clever, leaving breadcrumbs for someone with the training to follow them. What's his background? Webb rattled off details he'd pulled from classified databases they technically shouldn't have access to. SEAL Team 3, multiple deployments, specialized in direct action and reconnaissance. Silver Star, Bronze Star with V device, Purple Heart. The kind of operator who'd survive things that killed lesser men. Perfect, Vance muttered. Not perfect at all, actually. This was the worst possible complication. What do you want me to do? Webb asked. Vance thought carefully. The operation he'd spent 34 years protecting was too valuable to risk. The cash hidden in those caves represented not just millions of dollars in military equipment, but evidence of a conspiracy that went all the way to the Pentagon. Weapons deals, covert funding, operations that had reshaped foreign policy in ways the public would never accept. Thomas Cross had gotten close enough to be dangerous. That's why they'd killed his son. Not in revenge, but as a warning. It had worked, mostly. Thomas had backed off publicly, disappeared to that cliff, and they'd monitored him from a distance. As long as he stayed isolated and harmless, they let him live. But now there was a Navy SEAL poking around. "Don't approach yet," Vance said finally. "Watch him. Document everything. If he's just there to clean, out the house and sell, we let him go. But if he starts digging, if he follows Thomas's research, then we handle it." "Handle it how?" Vance's voice went cold. "However necessary. We've protected this for 34 years. We're not stopping now." He hung up and walked to the window, staring out at the Portland skyline. This should have been over. Thomas Cross should have taken his conspiracy theories to the grave, and the property should have eventually been sold to developers who'd tear down the house without ever discovering what lay beneath it. Instead, fate had delivered a trained special operator with every reason to be curious. Vance picked up another phone and dialed a number he'd hoped never to use again. "It's me," he said when someone answered. "We need the team reactivated, full coverage. The Cross situation has escalated." The voice on the other end was female, emotionless. "Termination authorized? If it becomes necessary." "Understood. We'll be in position by morning." Vance hung up and returned to the window. He felt no remorse. He'd done worse things for better reasons. This was just cleanup, making sure the past stayed buried where it belonged. Ethan Cross was a patriot, a warrior, a hero by all accounts. But heroes who asked the wrong questions had a way of dying young, just like his father. Ethan spent the first night in the house despite its condition. He'd slept in worse places: mud compounds in Afghanistan, rocky hides in the mountains of Iraq, the metal coffin of an aircraft carrier bunk. A dusty bed in a condemned house was practically luxury. Gage refused to settle, though. The dog paced the upstairs bedroom where Ethan had set up a sleeping bag, occasionally pausing to stare at the door with his hackles raised. "What is it, boy?" Ethan whispered for the third time. Gage whined, a low sound of unease that set Ethan's nerves on edge. Military working dogs didn't spook easily. If Gage sensed something wrong, there was something wrong. Ethan rose quietly, pulled on his boots, and grabbed the flashlight he'd left by his sleeping bag. He also grabbed the Sig Sauer P226 he kept within reach out of habit. Old instincts died hard. "Show me," he commanded softly. Gage led him downstairs, through the dust-choked living room, and back to the study. The dog stopped at the wall of maps, hackles still raised, and barked once. Ethan swept his flashlight across the cluttered space. Nothing moved. Nothing looked disturbed. But Gage was insistent, nosing at the baseboard beneath the map wall. "You smell something?" Gage pawed at the wood, claws scratching. Ethan knelt and examined the baseboard more closely. It looked wrong. The wood grain didn't match the rest of the wall. He pressed on it experimentally. It moved. His pulse quickened. He dug his fingernails into the seam and pulled. The baseboard came away, revealing a hollow space behind it. Inside was a metal box, the kind used for fireproof document storage. Ethan pulled it out and set it on the desk. No lock, just a simple latch. He opened it. Inside was a thick folder, a stack of photographs, and an envelope with his name written on it in the same careful cursive as the lawyer's letter. Ethan opened the envelope with trembling hands. "Dear Ethan, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've been smart enough to look deeper than the surface. Good. That means you inherited your father's mind as well as his face. I'm your grandfather, though I have no right to call myself that. I abandoned you and your mother after your father died. Not because I didn't love you, but because I loved you enough to keep you away from the truth that got him killed. Your father, Daniel Cross, didn't die in an accident. He was murdered because he discovered something powerful men wanted to stay hidden. I've spent 34 years trying to prove it, and I've failed. But I've left you everything I've learned. Beneath this house, accessible through caves at low tide, is a cache of military weapons and equipment stolen in the 1980s and 90s. Your father was investigating the theft when he was killed. The conspiracy goes higher than you can imagine. Pentagon officials, defense contractors, foreign buyers. They've kept it hidden for decades. I tried to expose them. They threatened me. I tried to investigate. They killed your father as a warning. I disappeared to protect you and your mother, but I never stopped digging. I'm asking you to finish what we started. Find the cache, document it, expose the truth. But be careful, Ethan. These people are still active. They're still watching. They killed your father, and they won't hesitate to kill you. I'm sorry I was never there. I'm sorry you had to grow up without knowing your family. But maybe, in finishing this, you can give your father's death meaning. The tide tables are in the folder. The cave entrance is directly below the house, accessible only during minus tides. You'll need climbing gear and lights, and you'll need to move fast. They're watching the property. Trust your training, trust your instincts, and trust that dog. I got him for you. His name was supposed to be Gage, like a tool for measuring truth. Make them pay, grandson. Thomas Cross. Ethan read the letter 3 times, each pass sending cold realization deeper into his bones. His father had been murdered. He'd inherited not just a house, but a mission. And somewhere beneath his feet was evidence of a conspiracy that had been killing people to stay hidden for 34 years. He opened the folder. Inside were copies of military shipping manifests, financial records, surveillance photos, witness statements, and a hand-drawn map of the cave system below the cliff. One photograph made his blood run cold. It showed his father, younger than Ethan had ever seen him, maybe 25, standing beside a military truck. He was in uniform, looking serious, holding a clipboard. The date stamp read March 1989, 2 weeks before he died, scrawled on the back in faded ink. Daniel Cross, Fort Lewis, investigating missing equipment. KIA 32889, made to look like accident. Ethan's hands shook. His entire childhood had been built on a lie. His father hadn't been a construction worker who died tragically. He'd been a soldier, murdered for getting too close to the truth. And his grandfather, the man he'd never known, had spent 3 decades trying to finish what Daniel started. Gage pressed against his leg, offering silent support. Ethan looked down at the dog. "You knew. That's why you wouldn't settle. You know something's wrong with this place." Gage's tail wagged once. "I'm with you, whatever comes next." Ethan spread the tide table on the desk. According to the chart, the next minus tide, the kind that exposed the cave entrance, would be in 4 days at 6:17 a.m., a negative 2.4 tide, which would expose rocks usually underwater. He had 4 days to prepare, to gather equipment, to plan the approach, and to figure out if he was really willing to dive into a conspiracy that had already killed his father and driven his grandfather into isolation. Outside, beyond the window, headlights flashed briefly on the access road before disappearing. Someone was watching. They already knew he was here. The game had begun. Ethan woke before dawn, the letter still clutched in his hand. He'd fallen asleep at the desk, surrounded by his grandfather's research. Gage lay at his feet, alert despite the early hour. The smart thing would be to walk away. Report this to proper authorities. Let the Navy handle it. These were the thoughts of the part of his brain trained to follow chain of command. But another part. The part that had volunteered for the most dangerous missions. The part that couldn't stand by when brothers were in danger. The part that had driven him through Bud-S when everything in his body screamed to quit. That part knew the truth. If this conspiracy had survived 34 years, it had protection. Going through official channels would just alert them. They'd destroy evidence, disappear witnesses, and probably arrange an accident for Ethan in the process. No. He'd do what SEALs did best. Operate quietly, gather intelligence, and strike when they least expected it. First, he needed equipment. Ethan drove into Crescent Bay and found a marine supply store on the wharf. The owner, a weathered woman in her 50s named Helen, eyed him curiously as he loaded up on climbing rope, carabiners, headlamps, waterproof bags, and underwater lights. "Planning some serious exploring," she observed, ringing up the purchases. "Just checking out some caves," Ethan said casually. "Heard there's interest in geology around here." Helen's eyes flicked to Gage, who waited patiently by the door. "That's a military dog if I ever saw one, and you've got that look about you." "What look?" "The look of someone who knows how to handle trouble." She bagged his purchases. "Whatever. You're planning out at that old house? Be careful. Strange things happen around Widow's Peak. Always have." "Strange how?" Helen leaned on the counter. "Tom Cross wasn't the first person to live there and become obsessed with secrets. Property's got a history. During Prohibition, it was used by smugglers. During World War II, the military posted lookouts there. In the 60s, some hippie commune tried to establish themselves and fled after 6 months, claiming the place was haunted." "You believe in ghosts?" "I believe in people keeping secrets," Helen said carefully. and I believe those secrets make some folks nervous. Tom was a good man, kept to himself, but good. About a year before he died, some city people came around asking questions about the property. Tom sent them packing, but they came back more than once. Ethan's attention sharpened. What kind of city people? The kind that wear expensive suits to a fishing village. The kind that take pictures and make notes. The kind that made Tom call me at 2 a.m, scared, saying someone had tried to break into the house. Did he report it to police? Helen snorted. We don't have police, just a county sheriff who shows up once a week. By the time Tom would have reported anything, whoever it was had gone. He started keeping his shotgun loaded after that. Ethan paid for the equipment and loaded it into his truck. As he drove back toward the Cliff House, he noticed a dark sedan parked on a side road, its occupants watching him pass. So they were making themselves known now. Psychological pressure, letting him know he was being monitored. It might have worked on someone else. But Ethan had spent years operating in places where everyone was watching, where one wrong move meant death. Surveillance didn't scare him. It just told him he was on the right track. Back at the house, he spread out his equipment and began methodical preparation. He'd done hundreds of training dives, but cave diving was different. More dangerous, more technical. One wrong turn in an underwater cave could mean drowning in darkness. Gage watched with interest as Ethan tested each piece of gear, his tail wagging whenever Ethan spoke to him. 4 days, buddy. Then we find out what Dad was killed for. That night, Ethan dove deeper into his grandfather's research. Thomas had been meticulous, cross-referencing dates, building timelines, connecting seemingly unrelated events. The pattern that emerged was damning. Starting in 1987, military equipment began disappearing from bases across the Pacific Northwest. Not large-scale theft that would trigger immediate investigation, but steady trickle losses. A few rifles here, some ammunition there, electronic equipment, communication gear. Over 3 years, it added up to millions of dollars in missing material. Daniel Cross had been part of a small investigative unit looking into the thefts. He'd traced the disappearances to a coordinated operation involving someone inside, military logistics, and someone with access to off-book transportation. His last report, dated March 20th, 1989, identified Fort Lewis as the central hub. He was supposed to meet with a confidential informant on March 28th. He died in a car accident on March 27th. The informant disappeared the same day. The investigation was quietly closed. Officially, the missing equipment was attributed to poor inventory management. No one was charged. But Thomas had found witnesses, low-level staff who remembered strange shipments at night, truck drivers who'd been paid cash to forget what they'd hauled, a retired quartermaster who admitted 30 years later that he'd been ordered to falsify records, and all of it pointed to someone in the Pentagon making the thefts disappear. Someone with enough power to kill an investigator and make it look like an accident. Someone who was still active, still protecting the secret. Ethan's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Walk away. The house isn't worth your life. He stared at the message, then typed a reply. My father's life was worth more than whatever you're hiding. Come try to stop me. He hit send and set the phone down. Let them know he wasn't backing down. Let them make the first move, because when they did, he'd be ready. The break-in happened on the third night. Ethan wasn't asleep. Couldn't sleep, really, knowing what was coming. He sat in the darkened study watching the access road through night vision binoculars he'd retrieved from his tactical gear. At 200 hours, 2 vehicles rolled up with their lights off. 6 men emerged, moving with tactical precision. Former military, Ethan assessed immediately. Their spacing, their hand signals, their weapons discipline, these weren't street thugs, they were professionals. Gage growled low in his throat. Ethan placed a hand on the dog's back. Easy. Let them commit. The team split. 4 approaching the front door, 2 circling to cover exits. Standard breach protocol. Ethan had prepared for this. As the lead man reached the front door, motion-activated floodlights blazed to life, temporarily blinding the assault team. Ethan had positioned them that afternoon, angled perfectly to destroy night vision. "Federal property," Ethan's voice boomed from a speaker he'd jury-rigged. "You are trespassing on the residence of a U.S. military officer. Leave now or face prosecution." The team froze, momentarily confused. This wasn't supposed to be occupied. The house was supposed to be abandoned, easy to search. The lead man recovered quickly, hand going to his radio. "We've got active resistance. Subject is aware." Ethan triggered the second surprise. A Marine air horn he'd mounted on the porch. The 120-decibel blast shattered the night, loud enough to be heard in town 4 miles away. The tactical team scattered, their element of surprise completely blown. Ethan emerged from the house, Gage at his side, his own sidearm visible but not aimed. "I'm Commander, Ethan Cross, U.S. Navy. Identify yourselves and state your business." The lead man, mid-40s, military bearing, the kind of gray area contractor who thrived in places where rules were flexible, held up his hands slowly. "We're private security, Commander. We have authorization to inspect this property for code violations." "At 2 in the morning? In tactical gear? Try again." The man's jaw tightened. "We were told the property was vacant. We're conducting a safety survey." "With suppressed weapons?" Ethan had spotted them through his NVGs. "Who sent you?" "That's proprietary. Get off my property, now, all of you." The team leader assessed Ethan carefully, calculating. A Navy SEAL, alert and armed, was not an easy target. The mission parameters probably didn't include open confrontation. "This isn't over," the man said finally. "I'm counting on it," Ethan replied. The team withdrew to their vehicles and drove away. But Ethan knew this was just the opening move. They'd been testing his awareness, his capabilities, his willingness to defend the property. Now they knew he was serious, which meant they'd escalate. Ethan went back inside and called the number from the lawyer's letter. It was late, but this couldn't wait. Jonathan Bergman answered on the 4th ring, sounding groggy. "Hello?" "This is Ethan Cross. I need to know everything about who's been trying to buy this property." A pause. Then, more alert. "Commander Cross, are you all right? 6 armed men just tried to break into the house. I need information now." Bergman sighed. "Tom warned me this might happen. There's a file in my office, correspondence from various parties interested in the property. Most gave up years ago when Tom refused to sell, but one group has been persistent. They call themselves Cascade Development, LLC. I need everything you have on them. I'll scan the files and email them to you first thing in the morning. Make it in the next hour." Another pause. "Commander, Tom left instructions in case something happened to you. He said if they came after you, I was to contact a specific person at the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. Should I make that call?" Ethan thought about it. Bringing in the IG might provide protection, but it would also slow everything down. Bureaucracy, investigations, red tape, all while evidence could be destroyed. "Not yet," Ethan said, "but keep the number handy. If I don't check in every 24 hours, make the call." "Understood. And Commander, Tom thought highly of you, even though he never met you. He believed you'd have the courage to see this through. We'll see if he was right." Ethan hung up and looked at Gage. The dog sat patiently, waiting for orders. "Tomorrow morning," Ethan said. "Low tide. We're going into those caves whether they're ready or not." Gage's tail thumped. Finally, action. Ethan spent the rest of the night preparing, checking equipment, reviewing his grandfather's maps. If there really was a weapons cache down there, it would be the proof he needed. And if someone was willing to kill to protect it, that made it even more important to expose. Outside, dawn broke gray and cold over the Pacific, waves crashing against the cliff with patient, relentless force. Somewhere out there, people were planning his death. But Ethan Cross had been preparing for death his entire adult life. The difference was, he was very good at making sure it happened to the other guy first. The morning of the minus tide dawned gray and cold, the Pacific churning beneath a sky the color of old steel. Ethan checked the tide tables one final time. Low tide at Zoico-17, with a negative 2.4 reading that would expose rocks usually 20 feet underwater. He had a 2-hour window. Gage sat in the truck, watching through the window as Ethan geared up, climbing harness, rope, waterproof bags containing lights, a camera, and his sidearm sealed in a waterproof case. He couldn't dive the caves. He didn't have the technical equipment for that. But if Thomas's maps were accurate, the main chamber was above the water line, accessible by a steep descent followed by a short swim. "You stay here, buddy," Ethan commanded. "Guard." Gage whined in protest. "I know, but I need you up here. If I don't come back in 3 hours, there's a letter in the glove box. It has a phone number. Someone will come help." The dog seemed to understand, settling with a huff of resigned acceptance. Ethan made his way to the cliff edge. The descent path was barely visible, handholds carved into the rock face decades ago, now weathered and slick with ocean spray. He rigged his rope to a sturdy anchor point and began working his way down. The climb was treacherous. Twice his foot slipped on wet rock. Once a handhold crumbled under his weight, sending his heart into his throat as he caught himself on the rope. The roar of the waves grew deafening as he descended, and the spray soaked him despite his waterproof layers. After 20 minutes of careful climbing, he reached a narrow ledge 40 feet above the current water line. Just as Thomas's map indicated, there was an opening in the cliff face, a dark mouth of stone barely visible above the retreating tide. Ethan activated his headlamp and pulled himself into the cave. The entrance was tight, requiring him to crawl on his belly for about 10 feet before it opened into a larger passage. Water sloshed around his hands and knees. The tide was still receding, but this chamber clearly flooded during high tide. He moved forward, following the passage as it angled upward and inland. The walls here were natural stone, worn smooth by millennia of tidal action. His breath echoed in the enclosed space, mixing with the distant thunder of waves. After 50 yards, the passage opened into a larger chamber. Ethan swept his light across the space and froze. He'd found it. The chamber was roughly 40 feet across with a ceiling high enough to stand, and stacked against the far wall were wooden crates, dozens of them marked with military stenciling. U.S. Army, Fort Lewis M16A1 rifles, QTY-50 ammunition, 10,000 rounds, Ethan approached slowly, documenting everything with his camera. The crates were old, but well preserved in the dry cave environment. He pried open one marked as rifles. Inside, wrapped in protective oilcloth, were M16A1 rifles, the variant used by the U.S. military in the 80s and early 90s. 30-year-old weapons, perfectly preserved, still tagged with their military serial numbers. This was it. This was what his father had died protecting. Millions of dollars in stolen military equipment, hidden in a sea cave, waiting to be sold to the highest bidder. Ethan photographed everything: the crates, the contents, the serial numbers. He pulled out a waterproof notebook and began making detailed notes. Each piece of evidence was another nail in the coffin of whoever had orchestrated this. Then his light caught something else. At the back of the chamber, half hidden behind the crates, was a more recent addition, a plastic case with modern latches. Ethan pulled it out and opened it. Inside were documents, shipping manifests, financial records, and photographs. One photo made Ethan's blood run cold. It showed a group of men in suits standing beside a military transport truck. The photo was dated 1988, and in the corner, someone had written names: Richard Vance, DoD Logistics, Colonel James Hartford, Fort Lewis Commander Senator William Morrison, Armed Services Committee, 3 men who'd been high-ranking officials in the 80s, now either dead or moved into even more powerful positions. The kind of men who could make evidence disappear, who could order a soldier's death and call it an accident, who could protect a conspiracy for 34 years. Ethan was photographing the documents when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong. Not the crash of waves or the drip of water, but the deliberate crunch of boots on stone. Someone else was in the cave. He killed his light immediately and drew his pistol from its waterproof case, water draining from the barrel. He'd practiced exactly this scenario 1,000 times, fighting in darkness, trusting his ears, controlling his breathing. Footsteps, multiple people, moving cautiously but not quietly enough. They'd followed him down. "Commander Cross," a voice called out, echoing through the chamber. Male, mid-50s, calm and authoritative. "We know you're here. Let's talk like reasonable men." Ethan didn't answer, moving silently toward better cover behind a stack of crates. "Your grandfather was a persistent man," the voice continued. "Admirable, really. He spent decades chasing this. It drove him mad, cost him everything. Don't let it cost you the same." A light flickered on, sweeping across the cave. Ethan counted 3 beams, meaning at least 3 hostiles, probably the same team from the attempted break-in. "What you found doesn't change anything," the voice said. "This operation is bigger than you understand. It's protected at the highest levels. If you expose it, you expose classified operations that kept this country safe for decades. You'd be committing treason." Ethan's jaw clenched. Classic disinformation. Frame the exposure of crime as itself a crime. "Your father understood that eventually," the voice said. "He was going to destroy careers, compromise national security, all to chase what he thought was justice. We couldn't allow that. They were admitting it. His father's murder." Rage flooded through Ethan, white-hot and consuming, but he forced it down, channeled it. Anger made you sloppy. He needed cold precision. "Last chance, Commander," the voice said. "Walk away. Forget what you've seen. Live your life, or force us to make you another tragic accident." Ethan made his decision. He activated his headlamp on its highest setting and threw it in one direction while moving in the other. The sudden blazing light drew all 3 hostile beams, and Ethan's gunshots followed a split second later. He wasn't trying to kill, just suppress. 2 rounds into the ceiling above them, raining rock fragments, then 2 more into the crate nearest them, wood exploding. The men scattered, their lights jerking wildly. Ethan moved, using his intimate knowledge of the chamber layout from studying Thomas's maps. He flowed between cover points, making for the exit passage. "Engage! Engage!" someone shouted. Gunfire erupted, muzzle flashes strobing in the darkness. Bullets sparked off stone, ricochets screaming. Ethan dropped, rolled, came up behind a natural stone formation. He had tactical advantage. He knew the terrain, they didn't. And they couldn't risk bringing down the cave with too much firepower. But he was outnumbered, and eventually they'd get lucky or pin him down. He needed to break contact. Ethan pulled a flare from his vest. Maritime safety equipment he'd brought for emergencies. He struck it and hurled the burning red stick into the center of the chamber. Brilliant crimson light flooded the space, destroying everyone's night vision instantly. Shouts of confusion. Someone fired blind, rounds pinging wildly. Ethan ran. He reached the narrow exit passage and dove into it, crawling frantically through the water-slicked tunnel. Behind him, footsteps pounded as his pursuers recovered. "He's heading out. Block the beach." Ethan emerged from the cave mouth onto the ledge just as the tide turned. Water was already rising, waves crashing higher. In another 20 minutes, this ledge would be submerged. He grabbed his rope and began climbing. Fast, sacrificing caution for speed. His hands slipped on wet rock, his shoulders burned with effort. Below, a voice shouted, "He's on the cliff face." Ethan didn't look down, didn't think about the gunman below or the 40-foot drop onto rocks. He just climbed, hand over hand, boots seeking purchase. A gunshot cracked. The bullet hit stone 2 feet from his head, spraying chips. But shooting upward at a moving target on a cliff face while standing on a wave-swept ledge? Nearly impossible. Ethan kept climbing. His hand found the top edge. He hauled himself over just as another shot rang out, this one close enough to feel the air displacement. He rolled away from the edge and ran for the truck. Gage was going insane in the cab, barking furiously. Ethan yanked open the door and the German Shepherd launched out, immediately taking a defensive position between Ethan and the cliff. "Load up! Go!" They piled into the truck. Ethan gunned the engine, tires spraying gravel as they rocketed down the access road. In his rearview mirror, he saw figures emerging at the top of the cliff. But he'd made it. He'd found the evidence. And now he had everything he needed to burn their conspiracy to the ground. If this story has you on the edge of your seat, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss stories like this. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more incredible true stories of courage and loyalty. Ethan drove straight through to Portland, not stopping except for gas. He couldn't go back to the Cliff House. That would be the first place they'd look. Instead, he checked into an anonymous chain hotel near the airport, paid cash, and registered under a false name. In the room, he spread out everything he'd photographed and documented. The evidence was damning, but he needed to understand the full scope before going public. Gage lay by the door, on guard, occasionally growling at footsteps in the hallway. Ethan's phone buzzed. Jonathan Bergman. "Commander Cross, are you all right? I received a strange call this morning from someone claiming to represent you, saying you'd had an accident. I'm fine. That's them trying to locate me. Don't tell anyone where I am. What's happening? I found what my grandfather was looking for. I'm bringing it to authorities, but I need one thing first. I need you to file a legal document with the county clerk today. Right now, if possible." "What kind of document?" "A notice that I'm granting the property and all its contents to the Department of Defense Inspector General's office, effective immediately. If anything happens to me, that makes it federal evidence in an active investigation." A pause. "That will protect it legally, but do it now, and make copies. Send them to every media outlet in Oregon. I want a paper trail they can't erase." "Consider it done." Ethan hung up and turned his attention back to the documents he'd photographed in the cave. The shipping manifest told a story of systematic theft, equipment signed out for training exercises that never happened, trucks dispatched to bases that didn't exist, paperwork filed under classification levels that made them invisible to normal audits, and the financial records showed where the money went. Offshore accounts, shell companies, and one name that appeared repeatedly, Cascade Development, LLC, the same company that had been trying to buy the Cliff House. Ethan ran a search on Cascade Development. The corporate structure was buried under layers of subsidiaries and holding companies, but persistent digging revealed the truth. Cascade Development was owned by a private equity firm that specialized in strategic government partnerships, and on the board of directors was Richard Vance. The same Richard Vance from the 1988 photograph. Now 70-something, retired from DOD, living comfortably in Portland as a defense consultant. Ethan had his target. But taking down someone with that level of connections and resources required more than just evidence. It required a strategy that left no room for cover-ups or convenient accidents. He needed to go public in a way that couldn't be suppressed. Ethan called a number he'd hoped never to use, a journalist he'd met during a deployment in Iraq, a woman who specialized in military and intelligence stories. Catherine Park, Washington Post. She answered on the second ring. "Ethan Cross, this is a surprise. I heard you were on leave. Kate, I need to meet. Today. I have a story that's going to blow the lid off a 30-year-old conspiracy." A pause. Then, cautiously, "I'm listening." "Not over the phone. Can you get to Portland by tonight?" "I'm in Seattle. I can be there in 3 hours." "Good. I'll text you an address. Come alone and come armed with legal backup. These people have killed to keep this quiet." "Ethan, what have you gotten into?" "My father's murder and a military equipment theft operation that goes all the way to the Pentagon. I have documentation, photographs, and a cave full of weapons. But we have to move fast. They know I have it." Kate's voice sharpened with the excitement of a journalist sensing a major story. "I'll be there. Send me everything you can beforehand so my editors can start vetting." On its way. Ethan spent the next hour scanning and uploading every photo, every document, every piece of evidence to an encrypted file-sharing service. Then he sent it to Kate, to Jonathan Bergman, and to 3 other journalists he knew to be reliable. Insurance. If they killed him now, the story would still break. Gage suddenly stood, a low growl rumbling in his chest. He was staring at the door. Ethan drew his pistol and moved to the peephole. 2 men in the hallway, not hotel staff. They were being subtle, but Ethan recognized the body language. Operators casing a room before entry. They'd found him. He grabbed his laptop, his evidence files, and Gage's lead. Back door, now. They slipped out through the bathroom window. Ethan had specifically chosen a ground-floor room for exactly this reason. As they dropped into the alley behind the hotel, he heard the door to his room being kicked in. Ethan and Gage ran, weaving through back streets, using every evasion technique he'd learned in SEER training. They doubled back, changed direction, moved through crowded areas where surveillance would struggle to maintain visual contact. After an hour, reasonably confident they'd lost pursuit, Ethan found a 24-hour diner and slipped inside. He chose a booth with a view of both entrances and ordered coffee. His phone buzzed. Kate Park. "I'm in Portland. Where are you?" Ethan gave her the address of the diner. 30 minutes later, Kate walked in. A woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and the kind of intensity that made sources nervous and editors excited. She slid into the booth across from him. "You look like hell," she observed. "Someone tried to kill me this morning." "I believe you. I've been reviewing your files. This is Jesus, Ethan. This is Pulitzer-level stuff. If it's real, it's real. I have photos of the cash, military serial numbers, financial records linking current DoD contractors to the original theft. And I have my grandfather's 34 years of research documenting the cover-up." Kate pulled out a tablet. "My editors want corroboration. Do you have anyone who will go on record? My grandfather's dead. My father's dead. Anyone else who knew about this either died or disappeared 30 years ago. Then we need someone current, someone on the inside willing to break ranks." Ethan thought about that. "What if I gave you Richard Vance, former DoD official, current board member of Cascade Development? He was in the original conspiracy, and he's still cleaning up loose ends. I can prove he's been threatening me, attempting to buy the property under false pretenses, and sending armed men to stop my investigation. Can you prove it?" Ethan pulled out his phone and played the audio recording he'd made during the cave confrontation. The voice saying, "Your father understood that eventually. He was going to destroy careers, compromise national security, all to chase what he thought was justice. We couldn't allow that." Kate's eyes widened. "That's confession to murder. Conspiracy to commit murder, at minimum. And I can place his men at my property, document their attempted break-in, and show a pattern of witness intimidation." Kate was typing furiously. "I need to conference in my editor and our legal team. This goes to print tomorrow morning, front page, if everything checks out. But Ethan, once this goes live, you're going to need protection. Federal witness protection, probably." "I don't need protection," Ethan said quietly. "I need justice for my father. You'll get both, I promise you that." They spent the next 4 hours building the story. Kate's editor called in favors, getting Navy officials to confirm Daniel Cross's service record and the suspicious circumstances around his death. They reached out to DoD for comment on the missing equipment reports from the late 80s. And everywhere they pushed, doors that should have been locked suddenly opened. It was as if the universe itself was tired of the secret being kept. By midnight, the Washington Post had a story ready to publish at 6 a.m. EST. Military equipment, theft conspiracy linked to current defense officials. Cover-up lasted 34 years, multiple deaths. Kate looked at Ethan across her laptop. "Once this goes live, your life changes forever. You ready for that?" Ethan thought about his father, about the grandfather he'd never known, about 34 years of lies and murdered silence. "Hit publish," he said. The story broke at 6 a.m. Eastern, 3 a.m. Pacific. By the time the sun rose over Portland, every major news outlet was running with it. Cable news showed the photographs of the weapons cache. Talk radio hosts debated the implications. Social media exploded with outrage and conspiracy theories. And in his Portland office, Richard Vance watched his world collapse in real time. His phone rang constantly. Lawyers, DOD officials demanding answers, board members distancing themselves. His carefully constructed life of respectability was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it, except eliminate the source. Vance made one final call. "I want Cross, today. I don't care how." The voice on the other end was hesitant. "Sir, with respect, the story's already out. Killing him now won't help." "It'll feel good," Vance snarled. "He destroyed everything. I want him gone." At the diner, Ethan watched the news coverage with grim satisfaction. Kate had done brilliant work. The story was airtight, thoroughly documented, impossible to dismiss as conspiracy theory. His phone rang. "Kate, you need to get to a federal facility right now," she said urgently. "I've been in touch with the DOD Inspector General. They want you in protective custody immediately. Vance is making moves. Our sources say he's desperate and dangerous." "Let him come," Ethan said coldly. "I'm done running." "Ethan, don't be stupid." "I'm not. But I am going to finish this properly." He hung up and texted an address to the burner phone number that had threatened him days earlier. The address was a warehouse in an industrial area. Isolated, abandoned, the kind of place where confrontations could happen without witnesses. Then he added, "Vance, you and me. Noon. Come alone or I send proof to FBI that you ordered my father's murder." He didn't expect Vance to actually come alone. But he expected Vance to come. Pride, rage, and desperation would demand it. Ethan had 4 hours to prepare. He drove to the warehouse and did what he did best, turned it into a battlefield of his choosing. He mapped sight lines, identified cover points, set up surveillance cameras streaming to a cloud server. He rigged tripwires and motion sensors, and then he waited, Gage at his side. At 11:45, 3 vehicles rolled up. Not surprising. 6 men emerged, tactical gear, suppressed weapons. And in the center, Richard Vance himself, silver-haired, expensive suit, the face of respectable corruption. Ethan stepped out from cover, hands visible, no weapon drawn. Gage stood beside him, hackles raised. "That's close enough," Ethan called out. Vance stopped 20 feet away. His men fanned out in a loose perimeter, but didn't raise weapons. Not yet. They were probably hoping to talk first, kill later. "Commander Cross," Vance said, his voice tight with controlled fury, "you've made a terrible mistake. I exposed a conspiracy. That's the opposite of a mistake. You've jeopardized national security operations. You stole military equipment and sold it to foreign buyers," Ethan interrupted. "You murdered a soldier investigating that theft. You spent 34 years covering it up. Now you're going to prison." Vance's laugh was bitter. "Prison? You naive child. I have friends in Washington who will bury this so deep it'll never see daylight. In 6 months, this will be a footnote. In a year, forgotten. Not this time. The story's already out. Multiple sources, multiple journalists, physical evidence. Even your Pentagon friends can't make that disappear." "They can make you disappear, though." Vance's expression hardened. "You should have taken the offer. Walk away, live your life. Now?" He shrugged. "Unfortunate accident, unstable veteran, PTSD. He'll be remembered as a conspiracy theorist who snapped." "Except you forget one thing," Ethan said, pulling out his phone. "I'm recording this conversation, and it's streaming live to 3 different journalists, my lawyer, and the FBI. Every word you've said is now evidence." Vance's face went white. "You really think I'd walk into this alone?" Ethan continued. I'm a SEAL, Vance. We don't do fair fights. We stack every advantage, eliminate every threat, and we never leave a brother behind." He gestured toward the warehouse. "You're surrounded. FBI tactical team moved into position 10 minutes ago. Your men are being targeted by snipers right now, and every single word of this conversation has been heard by federal agents." As if on cue, a voice boomed through megaphones. "Federal agents, drop your weapons, get on the ground now." Black SUVs roared out from concealment. Agents in tactical gear poured out, weapons raised. Laser sights danced across Vance's men. The mercenaries made quick calculations, federal agents versus paycheck, and chose smartly. Weapons hit the ground. Hands went up. Vance stood frozen, the full weight of defeat settling on his shoulders. Ethan walked up to him, stopping inches away. When he spoke, his voice was soft, but filled with the cold fury of a son speaking for his murdered father. "Daniel Cross was a better man than you'll ever be. He died protecting something you destroyed for profit. My grandfather spent 34 years in isolation trying to finish what Daniel started. And now I have." Vance's voice was barely a whisper. "It doesn't matter. They'll protect me. I'm too valuable." "You were valuable," Ethan corrected. "Past tense. Now you're just evidence. And when they're done with you, you'll die in a federal prison, forgotten, and your name will be synonymous with betrayal." FBI agents moved in, cuffing Vance. As they led him away, he looked back at Ethan one last time. "Your father died for nothing," he spat. "No," Ethan said quietly. "He died for the truth. And today, the truth won." 6 months later, Ethan stood in a federal courtroom in Seattle as the verdict was read. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder in the death of Specialist Daniel Cross, we find the defendant, Richard Vance, guilty. On the charge of theft of military property, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to defraud the United States government, guilty. The list went on. 17 counts total, each one carrying significant prison time. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, looked down at Vance without mercy. "Mr. Vance, you spent 4 decades in service to this nation, and you betrayed that service in the worst possible way. You stole from the military you swore to support. You conspired to murder a soldier investigating your crimes. And you spent 34 years covering up those crimes, threatening witnesses and destroying evidence." She paused, letting the weight settle. "The sentence of this court is life imprisonment without possibility of parole, plus 90 years consecutive for your remaining convictions. May God have mercy on your soul, because this court has none." The gavel fell. Ethan felt Sarah's hand squeeze his shoulder. Sarah Hartley, who'd flown up for the verdict along with Emma, both having become part of his life in unexpected ways. Kate Park sat in the press gallery, already typing her follow-up story. And Gage sat at Ethan's feet, service vest on, the goodest boy performing one final mission. They walked out of the courthouse into autumn sunlight. Media swarmed, but federal marshals kept them at distance. Kate found him on the courthouse steps. "You got him. You actually got him." "We got him," Ethan corrected. "Your reporting made this happen. Your evidence made this happen. I just told the story." She looked at him carefully. "What's next for you?" "Navy's offering you a promotion, I heard. Public Affairs is talking about your testimony before Congress on military equipment security." Ethan shook his head. "I'm done with all that. I completed my obligation, did what my father and grandfather couldn't. Now I just want peace." "You earned it." Kate extended her hand. "If you ever need anything, I'll call. Thank you, Kate, for everything." She walked away to brief her editors, and Ethan descended the steps to where Sarah and Emma waited. Emma immediately dropped to her knees to hug Gage. "Did you hear? The bad man is going to jail forever." Gage's tail wagged, as if he understood perfectly. Sarah looked at Ethan, a question in her eyes. "So, what now? Now?" Ethan smiled, a real smile, the first in what felt like years. "Now I rebuild a house." 8 months after the trial, the Cliff House looked almost unrecognizable. New roof, replaced windows, fresh paint, and the stormy blue-gray that matched the Pacific. The interior had been gutted and rebuilt. Modern plumbing, working electricity, insulated walls. The structure was still old, still perched precariously on a road and cliff, but it was home. Ethan had used the settlement money from the DOD, compensation for his father's wrongful death, to fund the renovation. Every board he replaced, every nail he drove, was an act of reclamation, taking back what had been stolen from his family. He'd also used some of the money to establish the Daniel Cross Memorial Fund, which provided support for families of service members killed in suspicious circumstances. If he could prevent another mother from raising a child alone, another kid from growing up without answers, it would mean something. The study was now clean and organized, but Ethan had kept his grandfather's research on the walls, not all of it, just the key maps and timelines preserved under glass. A memorial to 34 years of stubborn determination. Gage lounged on the porch in afternoon sunlight, his muzzle graying, but his spirit unchanged. The dog had earned his retirement, and he spent it doing what he loved, napping in sun, chasing seagulls and occasionally barking at the ocean as if scolding it for being too loud. A car rumbled up the access road. Sarah's vehicle. She'd started spending weekends here, helping with the renovation, bringing Emma to play on the beach and explore tide pools. Emma burst out before the car even stopped, running to Gage. "I brought tennis balls. Want to play fetch?" Gage was on his feet immediately, tail wagging. Tennis balls meant everything was right in the world. Sarah climbed out, carrying grocery bags. "Thought I'd make dinner. You do have a working stove now, right?" "Installed it last week," Ethan confirmed, taking the bags. "Still not convinced I know how to use it, though. That's why I'm here." They settled into comfortable routine. Sarah in the kitchen, Ethan setting the table, Emma and Gage playing outside until the sun began its descent toward the ocean. At dinner, Emma asked the question she'd been building up to. "Are you going to live here forever?" Ethan glanced at Sarah, who was carefully not looking at him. "I don't know about forever, but for now, yeah, I like it here." "Good, because Mom and I talked and we think you need someone to visit regularly. Make sure you're not getting too hermity." "Hermity isn't a word." "It is now." Emma's expression turned serious. "We like you, Ethan. We like being here, and I think Mom likes you extra." Sarah's face flushed. "Emma, what? You do. You get all smiley when he texts, and you talk about him to your friends, and—" "That's enough," Sarah interrupted, mortified, but Ethan was smiling. "I like your mom extra, too." Emma grinned triumphantly. "See? I told you." After dinner, after Emma had fallen asleep on the couch with Gage curled beside her, Ethan and Sarah stood on the porch watching the sun sink into the Pacific. "I'm sorry about the interrogation," Sarah said. "She's got no filter." "She's right, though. I do like you extra." Sarah looked at him, vulnerability in her eyes. "This is fast. We barely know each other." "I know you're the strongest person I've ever met. I know you raised an incredible kid mostly on your own. I know you've been there for me through the hardest months of my life, asking nothing in return." He took her hand. "And I know that for the first time in 15 years, I'm not thinking about the next deployment or the next mission. I'm thinking about tomorrow and the day after that, and maybe someday teaching Emma to sail and growing old on this cliff watching sunsets." Sarah's eyes glistened. "That sounds nice. Yeah. They stood together as darkness fell and stars emerged, the Pacific roaring its endless song below. Inside, Emma stirred and mumbled, "I knew it," before falling back asleep. Gage huffed contentedly, mission complete. 1 year after inheriting the Cliff House, Ethan stood on the newly rebuilt deck, morning coffee in hand, watching fog roll in from the ocean. Gage appeared beside him, slower now, arthritis in his hips but still the same loyal soul. Ethan scratched behind his ears. "We did it, buddy. Dad can rest now." The dog's tail thumped once. "I know." Ethan's phone buzzed, a text from his lawyer. "Final estate documents processed. Property is officially yours, free and clear. Your grandfather would be proud." Ethan thought about Thomas Cross, the grandfather who'd sacrificed everything to finish what his son started, who'd lived in isolation for 17 years, driven by love and stubbornness in equal measure, who'd planned everything, even his own death, to put the truth into the right hands. They'd never met, but Ethan felt like he knew him. They were cut from the same cloth, men who couldn't walk away from injustice, even when it cost them everything. In the months since the trial, Ethan had given interviews, testified before congressional committees, and become an unwilling public figure. Multiple documentaries were in production. Hollywood had called about film rights. He'd declined. Some stories didn't need to be entertainment. But the most meaningful recognition had come quietly, in a private ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery. Daniel Cross's name had been added to the memorial wall for service members who died in line of duty. The construction accident designation had been officially changed to Killed Investigated Military Equipment Theft. His service had finally been acknowledged. Ethan had stood beside his father's memorial marker, his mother on one side, still processing the truth about Daniel's death after 34 years of believing a lie, Sarah on the other, and he'd made a promise. "I finished it, Dad. The truth is out. Justice is served. You can rest now." A car pulled up, Kate Park, making good on her. Promised to visit and check in. "How's retirement treating you?" she called out, climbing from her vehicle. "Not retired, just repositioned. I'm consulting for the DoD IG now, helping investigate other equipment theft cases. Turns out this wasn't an isolated incident." "I heard you're making powerful enemies." "I'm making things right. There's a difference." They walked the cliff path, Gage trailing behind at his own pace. "I came to tell you something," Kate said. "The Pulitzer Committee is considering our reporting for investigative journalism. If we win, I want you on stage with me. None of this happens without you." "I don't need recognition." "I know, but other people need to see that one person can make a difference, that corruption doesn't always win, that justice might be delayed but it's not denied." Ethan thought about that. If it helps even one person stand up and do the right thing, then okay. They stood at the cliff edge where Thomas had stood for 17 years, watching and waiting. "He left you something, you know," Ethan said. "My grandfather, a message. It was in his final papers." He pulled out a folded note, weathered and creased. Thomas's handwriting, shaky but determined. "To whoever follows the trail I've laid, thank you for having courage when I had none, for finishing what I couldn't, for giving my son's death meaning. The truth is a burden, but it's also freedom. Carry it well." Kate wiped her eyes. "I'm putting that in the book." "What book?" "The one I'm writing. The Cliff House, a story of conspiracy, courage, and a family's quest for truth. You're okay with that, right?" Ethan smiled. "As long as you get Gage's role right, he's the real hero." As if on cue, the dog barked at a seagull, then chased it down the beach with surprising energy for his age. "He's a good dog," Kate observed. "The best. My grandfather's last gift. He got Gage specifically for me, hoping I'd come, hoping I'd bond with a military working dog, hoping I'd have a partner for what came next. He planned everything. Everything except dying before he could explain it all in person." Ethan looked at the house, solid and proud despite the elements that had tried to tear it down. "But maybe that was the plan, too. Leave me questions, make me search for answers, and sure, I'd uncover everything." "Think you'll ever leave this place?" "No. This is home now. First real home I've had since I was 6 years old." As the sun climbed higher, burning off the fog, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not the absence of conflict, but the presence of purpose fulfilled. He'd honored his father's memory. He'd completed his grandfather's mission. He'd exposed the truth and brought justice to those who'd evaded it for decades. And now, standing on this cliff with a good dog beside him and a family, chosen, not born, waiting inside, Ethan Cross finally understood what his grandfather had meant. The truth was a burden, but it was also freedom, and he'd carry it well. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the truth always finds a way, and that one person with courage can change everything. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments. What was your favorite moment? Was it Gage's loyalty, Ethan's determination to honor his father, or the moment justice was finally served after 34 years? We read every comment. God bless, and see you in the next story. 2 years later, on a clear spring morning, Ethan married Sarah on the cliff deck overlooking the Pacific. Emma served as maid of honor, wearing a dress she'd picked out herself. Gage was the ring bearer, carrying them tied to his collar with a ribbon. The ceremony was small. Kate Park, Jonathan Bergman, a few SEAL teammates, some townspeople from Crescent Bay who'd watched Ethan transform the cursed house into a home. As they exchanged vows, waves crashed below, seagulls wheeled overhead, and somewhere in the eternal blue, 2 soldiers and a stubborn old Marine watched and smiled. The truth had set them all free.